Um, so I sent out an agenda. Oops. I went to click on that button and everybody disappeared. Where are you? There we go. And before I get started, was there anything else people wanted to talk about that other than what I listed on that agenda? So this first thing was about updates, and just wanted to say we're very aware we haven't sort of done what we wanted to and promised, which is that we're working toward it, which is to get brief updates about all the targets on the website. And not to whine or complain, but just to sort of remind about the status that when we put the sustainability action plan together, we had a full-time project manager and we had Claudia in place, and that full-time project manager position, Elise left and that wasn't filled. And now Claudia is not with us. So we're doing our best, but not totally happy with what we're able to get done. I put in adding a biodiversity target, and I put this in for a couple of reasons. One is,
Marilyn, let me ask you a question. I realized, is there a time frame when you think it might be up? This report of the 10 targets?
I mean, so we have 2 targets updated on the website, target 5 and 10, and we have sort of some draft verbiage for the others. Damon, do you want to speak to?
Yeah, so there's kind of 2 pieces to it. One is we're trying to revamp the website, the dashboard pages we have on the website to make things a little bit more easy for us to update and easy for people to grasp really quickly what's going on in the targets. But then the second piece is just getting the information from the action owners. And we've been working fairly regularly. We've gotten quarterly updates, but to kind of speak to what Marilyn had mentioned before, one of the things our team has talked about a lot this year is how to better serve both this group, the ESC, and the action owners in terms of how to report the proper information and get the proper information from the action owners and not make it feel like too big of a burden on the action owners, while also getting the proper the information that everyone needs, and to understand what is the accomplishments, challenges, things like that, or things that need to come to the attention of this group. And Marilyn has kind of taken on the role of being the person that's really trying to reach out to all the action owners and both get a sense of what works and doesn't work for them and how we can improve that for them. When we've first gone through that, when we're kind of thinking about these updates, we'd sort of had in mind that when the director was hired, that that they would be able to start relatively quickly after that. And so Lisa is not able to start full-time until early May because she had travel in April. So our original time frame was that we'd sort of be able to shift roles a little bit earlier and get kind of figure out the process a little bit earlier. So we're working on it. Marilyn, I know, has talked to all the action owners and is kind of getting that information put together so that we can post it and send it out to you. So hopefully we'll have some updates relatively soon. And I think the hope is that certainly when Lisa comes on board, we can do this a little bit more, have a little bit stronger process when we, because that'll free up a little bit more of the resources. So I didn't quite answer. I don't have a specific.
No. That's the reason I asked the question, Damon, is I think we owe the campus stakeholders sort of a report in May or June, something like that, of what we accomplished in this year, and that becomes the springboard for the next plan. So it's not like I was looking for it tomorrow. I was just saying we got to get the information at some time before the end of this academic year, and then that was the thought.
Yeah, and we'll definitely have that. We're already sort of thinking about how best to kind of pull that type of report together, and if there's any changes from what we've done in the past few years in order to make that a little bit more digestible. And we've also been talking more about, I think Marilyn's going to touch on this a little bit more, but we've been talking, last year we'd kind of set up a process where every one of these meetings, a group of action owners did reported out. That felt, I think, after a little while that it wasn't as useful because there wasn't always useful information for the report. So we moved away from that kind of intentionally. And so we're kind of identifying if we've struck the right balance or what the right balance is to get, regular reports and make sure if there are things that need to be flagged, we can get it here. But yeah, in terms of the year-end report and kind of that wrap up, we're definitely moving on that, and that should be, on track, that we can put together something, certainly as the teams are working on towards the next year's actions and to report on what the year-end is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so I put down adding a biodiversity target, and one of the big questions is we talked last time about how flexible we are in terms of dropping actions if we decide that they don't make sense for us and such, and got the feedback, but we don't want to make dramatic changes. But right now, like, there are a couple of things out there. One is there's a conversation being led by a PhD student about mitigating the problem of birds hitting windows and dying, bird strikes. There's also our salmon safe certification, which is a little bit in jeopardy and needs to be addressed. So I wanted to bring up, do we have, are we okay with the idea of creating another target? If the answer is yes, then we can sort of move forward with that in mind and come up with a proposal. Or if you're feeling like that would be something we shouldn't do because it disrupts the 5-year plan. I
guess
Does that initiative, Maryland, fit in with one of the other 10 targets as a action item?
I don't think it really does. We've got waste, we've got food, we've got commuting, we've got emissions. We have academics, research, and engagement, and you could squeeze that into those, but there isn't anything that addresses sort of the health of the ecosystem on our campuses.
Yeah, the only reason I asked that question is, for example, we have this lake water cooling initiative that we're looking at that could potentially result in an improved environment for the salmon. And it's things like that will contribute to that initiative. There may be others with waste and that sort of thing that contribute.
Right, linkages between different targets. Yeah.
The only other thing that I would just bring up is that it may not fit under a specific target. One of the guiding principles of the Sustainability Action Plan is use resources responsibly, and the language that is fairly specific around kind of the environment and ecology. So it is sort of plan adjacent, and so one way to move would be to say that it sort of fits into the spirit of our overall sustainability goals, even if not towards a specific target. But that gets into other questions about how we prioritize things relative to the Sustainability Action Plan.
Yeah, I was going to say
the question is, Marilyn, your question is, are we open to adding a new one for the FY23 plan?
Right.
Yeah, so speaking for myself, I would be. I think it's fine to be adaptable and change as new initiatives come up, and we want to understand, well, does it distract from something? Well, but sort of to put it in play for me is just fine.
Jim, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, it's obviously a good thing to address, but the question is, it seems that a lot of our other targets are really carbon focused, and this one, while there can be a case made for a carbon focus, and sorry, I'm not sure why my camera keeps glitching out recently. While there seems to be a problem with the carbon, or no problem with having something that's not carbon focused, I feel like that's sort of the thrust of the rest of the plan. And so this might be something that needs to be a target outside of the current SAP, just so that we keep somewhat focused on that carbon target, maybe.
No, you'd started to say something earlier, did you?
I was going to agree with Damon. I don't disagree with Brian. I think we, that's what we're supposed to do. We set up a governance structure to reassess and each year establish specific actions for that year on the different targets. We can certainly modify, revise, add and delete targets in that process. But the initiative seemed to be more like a guiding principle to me. I was going to use those very words, that we want to contribute as an environmental sustainability good in this space. So I'm not against it being the 11th or not, but I would want to know a little bit more about what we hope to achieve. What would the specific, we would have actions, specific annual actions on this target, as opposed to hoping the other 10 targets contribute to improvements on this. So
Marilyn, I agree with Lou. I think that, and Brian, we can add something, but let's figure out what it is we can do in that area. So we at least have some actions pre-thought. Because, he mentioned about the lake water. Well, that's an issue we're looking at, so that would be fine. But I think to think about what we on campus can do about these two issues or other biodiversity issues. I think it's interesting that we are talking about bird strikes on windows, and we're, as a nation, are pushing wind farms which kill more birds than windows ever do, and we don't talk about that. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, I think if there's things actions we can take in these areas, but let's kind of think of what we could do before we adopt the target. That would be my thought.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I feel like the takeaway is that we could come back. I mean, partly the takeaway is that when Lisa comes on board, we'll tell her there's room for this, and this is a possibility, and give her some ideas, and then we can flesh something out and present it.
Right. And if you couldn't do it this year, you could have time to develop it more in detail for next year. So I think that's a possibility.
And Marilyn, as we do that, we should probably reach out to Grounds. They do have they have an integrated pest management plan, and I think some of their conservation plans also address kind of this. So make sure that we kind of understand any existing efforts and how that would tie into it.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Good. Okay. Then the next piece on the agenda is to talk about, I think we have sort of 5 cross-cutting concepts that apply to all of the targets. And this may be just to tee these conversations up for future discussion, or we might decide to dive into one of them. And I also sort of pause and say, as was working toward this meeting and this agenda, I'm very conscious that it's kind of this awkward space, because we have Lisa coming on board, and she'll have her direction and her insights, and in some ways don't want to set up a lot of things under my vision, for example. On the other hand, it's quite a while before Lisa comes, and we don't want to do nothing. So I'm seeing this as I've been doing my best to sort of get my arms around the challenges and the opportunities with the plan from the perspective of the office. So, and the more conversation we have, the more I can pass on to Lisa about this is what we've thought about. So in that spirit,
Marilyn, sorry to interrupt. One thing I wanted to touch on, you and I talked this morning about kind of things for this meeting, and one of the things I want to revisit the first bullet real quick, which is the sort of process and the reporting that you touched on. But I also just want to throw it out to this group very quickly. I'd mentioned last year we had more of the action owners specifically reporting out each meeting, and we sort of intentionally moved away from that to try to have a more flexible agenda. But I did want to have some space really quickly for the members of the executive committee to see what, if they have any specific thoughts on what has been working or not working about how we're using these meetings, and if any thoughts on should we move back to having, any more reporting, or is the way that we're working on this agenda working well? That was one of the things, Marilyn, you and I had talked about that we hadn't quite explicitly asked when you touched on that. So I just want to make sure there's just space for that discussion if anybody has any thoughts on just how we're using these meetings going forward. Yeah,
So
I'll leave it there.
I'll give you my thought. I thought instead of having the report outs, if we had a written report out of each of these targets, and then if an action owner needed help, then maybe that person could be invited and we can have a discussion. But if all we're going to do is have a reading of what we're reading ourselves, I'm not sure of the value of doing that. And so I think that a written report that is submitted to the members of this group prior to these meetings would enable us then to sort of identify whom we might wish to invite to come and talk to us.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I'd rather use these meetings to, make decisions and or provide guidance and to understand what support is needed so that we can go away from this meeting doing our job to help clear obstacles and that sort of thing to further progress. We don't often have problems presented to us by action owners and requests for support to knock down obstacles. And I think that's the value of having an executive committee is to engage the executive committee to help support making progress.
Thanks. Any other thoughts?
I think initially it was really helpful to talk through the targets kind of in the deck fashion that each of them was presented to sort of ground us, right? Like in where everything was. But I agree that like moving forward, unless there was, a large amount of information that we would need to be talked through, I think that the written update in advance would be fine too. But I think at the time, like going through all this in the first round was really helpful.
And I think that all ties into Marilyn, what we've been talking about, which is just figuring out how to best communicate and check in with the action owners and so that our office makes sure we understand where those obstacles are so that we can, make sure they get brought up here. So I think that's what we're already working on. I just wanted to make sure that we had a chance to hear from the members of the committee. So thank you.
Okay, so back to these cross-cutting concerns. So probably one that has come up is we're not feeling very satisfied with what's happening with the engagement target, and thinking we want to move more toward identifying engagement goals for each of the targets of the other targets in the action plan. And our ideas for engagement, are broad, but certainly opportunities for campus as a living lab in each of the areas, and kind of orienting toward, as much as possible, thinking, from the perspective of any member of our campus community, how can they engage? What are ways they can meaningfully participate? So for example, for target 8, the one that's about building performance, right now, it's what we have there is to some degree what is already happening. It's sort of the implementation of Norm's work, and now Dave Woodson's guidance for what happens with the buildings. And maybe that's perfectly fine and appropriate, but if we can expand it to be about, how can the building occupants support this work, and certainly the building coordinator. And also appreciating we can't just add that, that's not something we would ask Norm to do. But this question of if everyone who occupies a building has some role to play in, helping to identify problems in the building or looking for opportunities for the activities that happen in the building to be more efficient, that would be a way that everyone on campus would have a role to play. So conceptually, that's what we're thinking we want to move toward. Also appreciating that making those programs successful means more work and more capacity potentially.
Marilyn, it seems to me that you really go to the first one, that's communications. What are we doing and how can people engage? And then invite them to participate in some way. And we need to ensure that includes all 3 campuses.
Yes, well, John, could you say, what was your first sentence? I heard you say it's really about
what I said
communication.
was it's communication of what we're doing, the targets,
Right,
we're
right,
looking at
yes.
actions, and what specific actions are we pursuing, and how can people who are interested participate? What is the mechanism? Is it surveys or going to meetings or whatever it is? Because in a target, there might be 3 actions and there are 3 different groups of people, potentially, not necessarily the same ones. But I think communicating what we're doing and how people who are interested can engage would be the starting point. And then if you identify who some of these people are, when there's time for deliberation or conversation, send them emails and invite them to participate in a Zoom meeting or a survey or whatever. That would be a starting point, it would seem to me, because I think that a lot of people on all 3 campuses do not know what the Sustainability Action Plan is about.
Yes, yes. And that was let's say, I mean, yes, I have communication up there. Let's see, I don't know. I want to be sure if there's anyone else that has a comment before I respond to John.
I do, Marilyn.
Oh, yes. Sorry, Tony.
Yes, I think that, all of these teams are really working in silos and, they're trying to do their best, but then again, there is no integration in between them. And if, again, you said it where, it's just more work on top of everything else that everybody else is doing, especially you had talked about the building coordinators. It's like, oh, well, we'll have the building coordinators do that. Oh, well, we'll have the building coordinators do that. And they just adds to everything else that they do. And, we have some, great, communications, personnel, but they have to be focused on, what's happening right now, with one of these targets. And then they do need, just like John was saying, they do need to go ahead and follow them, ask what they're doing, what the movement is, and then just brag about it. But again, I think everybody is working in a silo, trying to do the very best that they can over and above the jobs that they already have. And you really need a communications team that is really focused on bragging about all the hard work that everybody's doing right now.
Jim, I see you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, I like what Tony's talking about there. And I think one of the ideas is, right, our engagement group is like the goals for the targets for the engagement group are somewhat vague, or well, at least they're concrete, but they're not concrete in how you do it, right? So it's like increase engagement by X%, but that, like, what the hell does that mean, right? Does that mean that many more % people showing up at volunteer events? That means that many more hits on our website? Does that mean, that many more dollars for Lou? I mean, it's like, there's different ways that there's engagement could be measured. And I like the idea of setting engagement about our other targets, right? So it's not just engagement in, sustainability writ large, but it's engagement in the specific things we're talking about for this action plan, which seems to me to make sense. And I think that probably what we want to do is think about one at a time, right? So whatever, if we want to pick one hot topic that's sort of in action at a particular time, why don't we try to build, like one idea, the buildings, right? So why don't you turn it into, rather than creating work for the building people, why don't you create a student activity that then is sort of broadcast out to the faculty as an opportunity for that living lab, right? So use your students to communicate, because that's a big piece of who you're trying to communicate to. Or at least by communicating to students, you're also communicating to faculty because they're getting involved as well. So I feel like, what if the students are actually have an activity where they need to go through and look for, I don't know, I'm making stuff up, but look for opportunities for, decreased, energy use or water use or something along those lines. So different things that get them thinking about it, quantifying it, doing what they need to do as students, which is learning and figuring out how to assess these sorts of things. But then it turns into something that's both engagement and potentially something useful as feedback to these different action items. So that might be one opportunity, is just to pick one and run with it, right? So to get a group of faculty that want to come up with an activity that we can do. We've done this across campuses before for some things related to how you do climate change education or footprint education, that kind of thing before. So it would be kind of a cool activity to pull in some faculty to design something that we can see how it could play out in multiple different classes.
Mm-hmm.
And I just created work for myself, which is really not a good idea.
Krista.
I need to learn how to shut up.
You and me both, Jim. But being the one student here, I'm going to go ahead and chime in only because I've been working on this engagement target and working on some of the language for it. And I think another nuance to add to this is obviously thinking about our different communities on campus, right? There's our staff who are charged with implementing these actions and these targets. And then there's this huge gap between our staff and engaging, exactly what Jim was saying, engaging faculty and through faculty students with these actions. And so I think, if we're looking at revising the engagement target, it would be really great to look at the actions based around the different communities instead of just lumping them all together, saying, we're going to engage faculty, students, and staff. Say, we're going to do X with faculty. We're going to engage faculty around living lab opportunities that apply their research expertise to these targets. We're going to support action owners with engaging with faculty, to create teams around them that they feel supported on. And I think the central piece to all this goes to one of our other actions, is really advancing the campus as a living lab. And I think we can harmonize the engagement and the living lab by revamping this engagement target to really be focused on bridging that existing gap between staff and facilities and academics.
Tony, I see you have your hand up.
Dave Whitson has, a huge hurdle to go ahead and work through. But, as Lou said, there's a lot of advantages. You talk about the water temperature in the lake. It could go sideways too. And, but if there was a lot of positive views, a lot of things that could help support Dave and what he has to do, and then knowledge about the steam plant and where we're going and all of that, that engagement would be so exciting for the team to be really focused and take one bite at a time. Just like Jim was talking about, this thing looks so huge, but if we took these bites and then really focused that team in these targets, I think it would be so much more exciting for the engagement group as well.
Mm-hmm. Anne, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a rabbit trail, so I wanna acknowledge that before I say it as we hippity hop. But I'm wondering if an additional target needs to be, and this redounds to engagement, or it could be enveloped under engagement, and that is if we actually create a goal or a strategy inside engagement associated with fundraising. we talk about how we could engage advancement, and what advancement, of course, is all about is looking to the community and looking to our grads associated with this, and actually no longer kind of just talking about, gosh, we should do something different in the advancement area. Advancement is an interesting marriage between what dollars are available in the ether and what dollars are available from our alums or our friends. And fundraising might be an interesting way of dealing with that, in addition to the living, learning lab things that Jim is talking about and making work for himself on. But I'm wondering if we should think about, in terms of, as we talked a little bit about creating targets, is if somehow we need to give ourselves work. I certainly would sign up for this, as to how we could move forward with in engaging a fundraising part of this, in terms of additional dollars, whether it be grant, whether it be advancement, whether it be Kickstarter campaigns. I keep wondering whether or not we could get permission to move forward in the advancement arena and support for that.
Mhm, mhm. Sustainable bake sale. That sounds nice.
I'm sorry, but brownies are always sustainability options.
Absolutely. I just know I don't have to do any baking if I do a Kickstarter.
I'm mindful of Anne's rabbit trail comment. I don't know if I can make that worse or better here, but I was thinking about the target one and the engagement, and as compared to many of the other, in fact, I think just about all the other targets are quite numerical. There's 6% or 45%, and so this one has the sort of sheen of metrics, and if you dig into it, there's some metrics, but I think this one suffers from not having a clear, and I think that's what's driving a lot of the conversation, like what does double engagement mean? And we could define it quite narrowly, like it's the number of page views of a website, or whatever, the number of registrations in a certain kinds of courses, or whatever they are. But I think this one, and I again acknowledge, I often think of things as in project language, but the expression about plan, do, check, act, I think we're at the check phase, like we've kind of run this a bit, and is this one needing retuning, for going forward? And I think that goes back to the original topic you raised, Marilyn, about can or should we tweak this going forward? I would say the answer is yes, and this is an example of one I might tweak inside of the original 10, aside from adding an 11th or a 12th.
I told Marilyn this morning that this target has felt a little bit like trying to push a giant pile of Jell-O, and that it feels like when it started that there was kind of some definition, but the more you kind of push at it, the less that definition starts to feel wobbly. So as someone that's been kind of tasked around thinking of this communication for a lot over the last couple of years, I think that anything we can do to kind of bring it to a more concrete level and kind of get more specific actions is going to be helpful, because it's been it's been one that's been kind of difficult, and the more we've kind of worked at it, the more we realized that there just wasn't that specificity, so it's been easy to get kind of pulled in different directions.
And I would say, following up on what Damon was just saying, is that we did look into this, right? For almost exactly what you were just talking about. We put together a potential survey to get feedback from faculty on what they were doing, to get feedback from people on number of volunteers for events, to collect standardized data across the 3 campuses on page hits and social media things and whatever the hell you call those. And it just feels hollow, right? It just feels like what we're doing is using some straw metric that really has no teeth to it, or real no, if I was forced to explain what that meant for engagement, I would have to make some shit up. And so I feel like like what
Yeah.
we're talking about now seems like a much better idea for engagement. Yeah.
I'm gonna pause and ask sort of the direct question. I keep hinting at we need more resources to do more. And I know everybody says that. And are you all wanting to tell me, no, Marilyn, you need to just figure out what you can do with what you have? Or are you thinking, I think sustainability ought to be able to do more with what you have? Or are you just, I don't know how we can get more resources? Or Marilyn, you need to go figure that out, or Lisa needs to figure that out. You know, what are you thinking about in particular, what the sustainability office ought to be able to do or should be able to do?
I'll start. I mean, this is a common theme for every unit we have, probably of any kind, facilities or otherwise. And so I think there has to be some introspection about, are we doing the right work? You know, are there some things we could stop doing? Which again, everybody asks themselves that kind of question, right, Tony, or whoever, you know, there's things you'd like to do that you can't. And so I think we have to look at that. And, you know, we do have a way of requesting and planning for positions going forward, you know, within facilities. So that can be explored too. But I think we, in parallel, have to ask, are there things that are less important than other things that we can decide to either not do or do less of? So I don't know if that answers your question, but
I just think if you further define, just like Damon was looking at, you know, he's trying to push this big sludge. If all of a sudden he finds out that you know, he and Torin can go ahead and brag about one of these targets and really focus on it, you know, then it's not as huge, and maybe you don't need that additional person. But again, they're very quick and defined, and they do a fantastic job at anything that they're doing. But maybe if we just kind of trim it down and say this is the scope, then they can push it a lot easier.
Yeah, I think it's two directions here, Marilyn. I agree with what Steve is saying. I'd also add that you know, it's prioritization, number one, but also when you talk about resources, you know, this executive committee, the environmental stewardship committee, the entire campus is a resource for us. And I know our sustainability FTE count is pretty low, but we have access to a lot of resources, and we have some structure in place here. We talked about this a lot at the ESC recently. How can we leverage those resources to move forward on these initiatives? And I think that's part of what we're needing the team soon to be led by Lisa. That'll be a conversation I know Steve and I will have with her. At the same time, if you can put an argument together that says, you know what, if I had 2 more FTE to do this, here's what I could do, that would provide leadership with the information that we need to make decisions on providing more financial resources to hire more people at the expense of not hiring people elsewhere for something that's lower priority. You gotta kind of make the case that this is what we're going to do, the impact we can have, and the value it can add.
Thanks. Okay, perhaps, well, I'm not sure how this next topic segues, but the idea about policy, like this has particularly come up with target 5, that the professional travel target, that we had a student who came up with some policy ideas. Is policy something that this group can facilitate? Should we be looking at our capacity for, you know, do we need other people on the EC who have particular policy skills?
Is there anything in mind that you have, Marilyn, on policy? This kind of gets into the next topic on, I'm not sure what the topic is, but on if it's sustainability definition, that's kind of a policy-ish type thing where we're looking for an edict from leadership on what we do moving forward. But is there anything more from a policy perspective that you have in mind?
Well, so for target 5, I mean, we talked about having, you know, over the course of our conversations, we've talked about having policies around carbon offsets, and then also possibly even policies around, you know, when people should travel, and realizing that that's a very contentious topic. And I'm not remembering, you know, our student Maggie, who's an Evans student, put together a whole list of potential policies. We had a professional travel meeting just last week, and April from the travel office was there. She's new to our group, and she said how in their office they do address policies. I mean, first they have to be sure that their work is aligning with state policy, but occasionally a policy will come along around travel, and it might be a policy around you know, maybe travel to countries that have you know, there are concerns for, I don't know, health concerns or whatever. And then, so they have a mechanism where they'll reach out to stakeholder groups and they'll say, here's a proposed policy. What are, you know, unintended consequences of this? And then they'll also look at peer institutions and who have similar travel needs and see what they're doing. So that struck me that, oh, there's this procedure to present a policy, to explore the implications, and you know, move it forward. And I wouldn't have known that, and I don't. And maybe there are people in this group already who know that, who could help us if we have an idea for a policy we want to move forward. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think within each of the 10 targets, if policy recommendations result as actions we want to pursue, I think that's absolutely within scope.
Marilyn, during the COVID time, you know, it was so easy to go ahead and take a, you know, a run and just brag about how good all of us have been not traveling. But, you know, as soon as these masks are off and everybody is going, you know, back to their conferences, and, you know, professors that, you know, are going to fly here and there, you know, just, you know, because they have to, it's going to go back to the way it was, I believe. And if there was a policy, and it is going to be contentious, and then there's going to have to listen to a lot of people on the reasons why. But that one, I believe, you know, is going to get away from us if there isn't some policy that's higher than us that says, you know, here's what you can and can't do. And the reason being is that we're trying to, you know, focus on this target. But travel is going to be one that is going to, I think, is going to really skyrocket.
And did my story about how they look at travel in the travel office, is that I'm trying to ask a question about, is that something the EC or any of you, if a group like, well, we can take the professional travel group, if we put together a proposed policy, do we now have the capacity? Can the EC help with that? Or do you think we should bring on other people who have, specialty expertise, or maybe even just bring them on temporarily, invite them to a meeting?
Well, Marilyn, my view is the policies are going to be written by the proponents for this particular activity. And if you want to create some kind of a policy for travel, professional travel, there needs to be a philosophical conversation with the Board of Deans and Chancellors and the leadership of the university, because travel is approved by the people at the top. And we have to get their buy-in before you start putting pens to paper. But if there's an agreement that philosophically this is a good idea, offsets is a separate issue. The first issue is, can we curtail professional travel? If professional travel is required, can we provide voluntary offsets, or are we going to have mandatory offsets? And if so, what are they? Are they offsets where the funding would be used on the University of Washington campus to fund additional sustainability activities, or they go out to buy offsets in the commercial? So there's a lot of things to be thought through on the action, but we have to have a philosophical agreement, it seems to me, among the leadership that this is a good thing to do. And so you can't shove it up from the bottom, I don't think. It has to be buy-in at the top, and then the bottom can come up with the tactics about how to do it.
Yeah, I would say from a practical standpoint, the way that manifests is if there's an idea on a policy recommendation, we can talk in the executive committee and evaluate the positive impact and or the challenge with implementing, and decide whether or not we go up to leadership to work on getting that buy-in. Same process pretty much that we did for, vetting and socializing the definition of sustainability with leadership. We could do that with a policy as well.
Okay, yeah.
Travel policy is a really good one. That's something where I think before we bring it, we would need to have some analysis on what the positive impact could be, or the negative consequences of not having a policy. Some measurement or some compelling argument that says explains why we recommend something.
And then how much does that greenhouse gas, how much is it worth compared to doing other things? It's, comparative that way.
Yeah.
We may be really surprised that scope 3 greenhouse gas is worth millions and we don't know it, but at least we would be able to go ahead and be part of your presentation.
So great. You all answered my question that indeed we do have the capacity within this group to figure out how to move that forward. So that's, and I think we will add, kind of this idea that all the targets can and should be thinking about if there are policies that are relevant parts of making progress on them.
I just
yeah,
wanted to
Jim.
fill up one idea. I'm sorry, it is, and try not to think about the one particular policy we're just talking about, but I think marketing, often policies get sort of put together in a way that's doesn't talk about the overall impact, right? So I feel like somebody mentioned that already. So I think it is, if we're trying to sway, that last policy is going to be about faculty, or at least a large portion of it is about faculty travel, right? And so therefore that demographic has to be thought about when you're thinking about how do you market that, right? How do you actually sell that policy or present that policy in such a way that you're actually showing the faculty what their potential impact is, what their potential role is, right? So what's the university looking at, how does that impact their job? So I feel like how we present the policy very much sways whether it's even thought about to move it up the chain and to bring it out to the faculty or not. So I think that's one of the things we have to be wary of, is at this point, we don't want to be the policy that just kind of comes up, this think tank comes up with it and throws it at the faculty. You want to come up with something that very much is marketed for hopeful success with the faculty, and isn't just the like what the restrictions, the number of miles, whatever it happens to be, like that's a different thing. I think there really has to be that thought about how would we make it fly when we put a policy together. And that might be bringing in a subgroup to kind of think about how do you make this, right? That's a community-based marketing or whatever the hell it's called, right? That's a different type of thing than maybe any of us have expertise in.
But yeah, that we could be part of creating that subgroup. Okay, just 5 more minutes. I'm being distracted by Steve's message. Okay,
Right.
I have the definition and centering equity. Aligning our work with the definition and centering equity. I feel like those are 2 things that we are wanting to do and are making some progress with, but aren't feeling very good about the degree to which we're successful with those. And the one question I put here is, where should this conversation happen? Should we just be talking to the action owners? Can this group, can the EC be wrestling with how do we align? How do we set our equity and how do we align with the definition?
Not sure I understand why you're asking the question. We've got our 10 targets, and equity is, part of all 10 of them in various ways. We absolutely should be having that conversation. That's part of the purpose here. We have action owners that we're trying to leverage and empower and encourage to go out and do great things. We should be supporting them, and where they need support in furthering those initiatives, that's what we're doing. That's what the purpose of the committee is. I may not be really understanding the question. I think the conversation should be happening in the working groups for all 10 targets. And as needed, as support is identified, where executive committee help can be applied, we bring those discussions to this forum.
Yeah, Marilyn, my thought is to look at, is there an equity component to any of our action plans? In some cases, I think it's not. I mean, if we're trying to address climate change, we want to make sure whatever we're proposing doesn't adversely impact anybody, but everybody benefits by us reducing our carbon emission, it seems to me. And if we adopt solar power, solar panels on buildings, where they're at and that sort of thing. So I think that, is there an equity component to each one? In many cases, the answer is yes, but in some cases, everybody is going to benefit across the board by some of these initiatives, it would seem. I don't see how you could take the professional travel one, for example. If we reduce professional travel by 10%, does that adversely impact any specific group? Well, it shouldn't, because it shouldn't be applied across the board to all faculty, and we're reducing our admissions. And so, but in other cases, it could be different. So I think we should question it in each one, and where there is a component to highlight that we're doing this thing in an equitable way. But in some of the cases, it's climate change we're trying to reduce.
Okay, I've got some questions, or raised hands. Christoph and then Jim.
And yeah, just to add a little more context, I think I worked on a equity impact assessment tool that the action owners would use annually. And the idea was that every year around this time, when action owners get together to reevaluate where they're at with their actions and to determine what next year's actions would be, that they would use a tool to determine, like you were just saying, John, does this action have due burden or benefits to communities that this impacts? And further, working with our EDI coordinator this year, we assess not only should action owners be doing this, but we should invite those impacted communities to be a part of that conversation, to say, how and in what ways would this action impact you? And so those are the two communities we think we need to engage with on an annual basis and make this part of the annual action planning process. We haven't effectively done that yet. Last year, we shared that impact assessment tool with action owners To what degree they actually utilize that and integrate it into their actions is a little bit vague, but I think we need to keep using that every year. And further, we need to invite the impacted communities into that conversation, first and foremost, to make sure we understand how these actions may burden or benefit them. So that's part of what we're trying to do, but so it's a little bit more background to this, I think.
Okay, we're at 2:30. Jim, can you give us your conversation before the clock turns to 2:31? Or give your comment?
Yeah, sorry, I agree with what was just said. I was just thinking that what often helps is if we have one person in the room whose job it is to always ask that question as we're having these conversations here, right? So whenever a new thing is up here, rather than necessarily having a whole tool that had to be applied beforehand, we just need one person's job here is to always ask, so how does this impact equity? And it's not equality, right? It's equity. So even though something like a travel policy could be applied across the board, that might actually have undue impacts on international faculty that rely more on travel internationally for their scholarship versus, right? And that could potentially be an equity issue. So there's just, we need to really think about, and we need to include that in our policy, that we've addressed those, not just talk about it and leave it unwritten.
Thank you very much, everyone. Helpful thoughts to move forward with. I really appreciate this.
Bye, folks.
Thanks, Marilyn.
Oh, Marilyn.
Uh-huh.
Did you have any questions? Thank you for agreeing to give a talk for the Think and Drink. Did you have anything I can tell you about that you want to know right now? I sent you some info about it.
You did, and I marked it, and I thought I was impressed. I thought this guy knows how to, to get people to start thinking about. You gave me a deadline, and yeah, I had one day to. I don't yet, but
Okay.
it's on my radar,
Okay.
And
no worries.
Yeah,
Just let me know if you have questions. I'm happy to answer them, and it should be.
Okay.
I'm glad that you're giving a talk. That should be really fun. So
hope so. I'll do
All
my
right.
best.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.